Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal were caught on camera in a heated argument at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, and the single name positioned at the absolute combustible center of that confrontation was Alexandra Eala. Two men who invested 20 years redefining the outer boundaries of human athletic achievement. Two legends who had publicly dissolved every competitive tension between them beneath retirement's graceful, carefully managed afterglow. Standing opposite each other inside those Manacor walls with an unguarded, undiplomatic intensity that coaching cameras were never constructed to capture, and nobody in that building had the authority to authorize. This was not a rivalry reignited across a tennis net. This was something exponentially more consequential. Two of the sharpest, most ferociously competitive minds the sport has ever housed, locked in irreconcilable disagreement over who held the legitimate right to shape the professional future of the most electrically compelling young woman currently inhabiting women's tennis. Because Ayala had transformed into something neither legend fully anticipated from the comfortable distance of retirement observation. And when two men whose entire existences were constructed around competitive precision both identified the same once-in-a-generation talent simultaneously, both arriving at the absolute conviction that they understand exactly what she requires next, the collision between those convictions isn't measured, diplomatic, or quiet. Stay locked in to every word of what follows, because what those cameras captured inside the Rafa Nadal Academy during July 2025 represents only the visible surface of a story running far deeper, far more personally, and far more consequentially than any headline generated in its immediate aftermath possessed the investigative courage to tell with genuine completeness.
If you just watched one point, if you just watched the match point for that match with Carlos hitting a four on the run forehand winner off of a feast overhead at like 200 miles per hour. It was awesome. But that was basically the whole match. I mean, it was from start to finish. Carlos was insane. I think he's 12-0 now on the year and just doesn't seem like he is going to be stopping anytime soon, which is not surprising from what we've seen the last couple of years. But he looks great. Yeah, the one mini hiccup with a set lost was out of character for somebody of his level, but he got the job done, takes another title, and just continues to roll on.
July 2025. The Rafa Nadal Academy in Manacor, Mallorca, sits under afternoon heat that visitors from Northern Europe find immediately confrontational. The terracotta courts absorb and radiate warmth in cycles that veteran players learn to work with rather than resist. Junior students move between sessions with the focused exhaustion of young athletes being constructed towards something demanding. Academy staff navigate their routines with the practiced efficiency of an institution that has, across a decade of operation, established precisely what it believes excellence requires. Then, Roger Federer arrives, and every established routine in that building recalibrates instantaneously. The official narrative surrounding Federer's July 2025 Manacor visit was warm, nostalgic, and carefully managed. Photographs circulated across social media showing Switzerland's greatest sporting export moving through the Academy's grounds, signing autographs for wide-eyed junior students, examining the facility's infrastructure with the appreciative attention of someone encountering the physical embodiment of a rival's legacy, exchanging the kind of relaxed, sunlit conversation with Academy staff that retirement's freedom permits in ways competitive careers never did. It read, publicly, as a sentimental pilgrimage, two legends sharing physical space during the graceful chapter following their respective retirements, the kind of gesture that tennis's narrative machinery produces and distributes with efficient warmth. Former rivals united by the sport that formed them, mutual respect undimmed by competitive distance. What the official photographs excluded was the undercurrent that every senior Academy staff member present that afternoon recognized within approximately 40 minutes of Federer's arrival. He was watching Ayala train with an attention that had nothing sentimental about it whatsoever. Federer had followed Ayala's Miami Open trajectory with a specificity that went considerably beyond casual observation. Sources close to his inner circle confirmed that he had watched her Ostapenko match twice, her Keys demolition 3 times, and her Swiatek quarterfinal, the match that announced Ayala's arrival at women's tennis's highest competitive level, 4 complete times across 4 separate viewing sessions. He had taken notes. Physical, written notes, the kind of analytical documentation that someone undertakes when they are building a professional assessment rather than enjoying a sporting spectacle. By the time he stood courtside watching Ayala move through her afternoon training session in Manacor, Federer had already constructed a detailed, technical evaluation of what he believed her game required at this specific developmental juncture. Her footwork efficiency in defensive positions, the mechanical inconsistency that occasionally surfaced in her second serve placement under pressure, the tactical decision-making patterns that her Miami victories had partially exposed, despite, not because of, their results. He had arrived at the Rafa Nadal Academy carrying that evaluation with the quiet, contained purposefulness of a man who had identified a specific conversation he needed to have and intended to initiate it before the afternoon concluded. Nadal, watching from a different courtside position, noticed Federer's quality of attention within minutes, and the question forming behind Nadal's eyes, the one every person in that building would eventually understand had been forming, was one that 2 decades of competitive coexistence had equipped him to read with uncomfortable precision. What exactly does Roger Federer believe he sees that I am missing? That question, unspoken across an afternoon of courtside observation, was the pressure building beneath ground level. The eruption came later, but the fault line had been identified the moment Federer's gaze locked onto Ayala mid-rally and refused to release. The conversation began in a room that Academy staff described as the facility's primary tactical analysis space, equipped with video playback systems, court diagrams, and the kind of deliberate functional austerity that serious coaching environments favor over comfort. Federer requested a private discussion with Nadal following the afternoon training observation. Nadal, characteristically direct in his professional engagements, agreed without requiring elaboration of the subject matter. Both men understood the subject matter before either spoke a word of it. What was said across the first 20 minutes of that discussion was, by multiple accounts from individuals briefed afterward, substantively professional. Federer articulated his technical observations about Ayala's game with the analytical precision that his own playing career had demonstrated was intrinsic to his competitive intelligence. He identified specific mechanical elements he believed required reconstruction at a foundational level, adjustments that he argued would unlock a ceiling currently constraining her development, despite the extraordinary results her Miami week had generated. Nadal listened with the focused patience of someone who had spent 7 years watching Ayala develop from a 13-year-old arriving in Mallorca into the athlete currently ranked among the top 50 players alive. He responded with the contextual authority that longitudinal proximity provides, explaining developmental decisions, training philosophies, and the specific reasoning behind approaches that Federer, observing from outside the Academy's internal architecture, was evaluating without the complete informational picture those 7 years had accumulated. The conversation was, for 20 minutes, exactly what 2 of tennis's most analytically sophisticated minds engaging genuinely on a subject of shared interest should produce. Then, Federer proposed something that changed the temperature of everything. He wanted direct coaching access to Ayala, not as a replacement for the existing academy structure, not as a challenge to Nadal's foundational relationship with the athlete his academy had developed, a supplementary arrangement. Federer's specific technical expertise applied to the particular mechanical areas he had identified as requiring attention, structured around the academy's existing program without displacing it. The proposal was framed collaboratively. It was delivered without the aggressive, territorial energy that its content might have suggested. Federer genuinely believed, and this sincerity is important to understand because it explains everything that followed, that what he was offering Ayala represented an opportunity with no legitimate competitive equivalent. His specific technical mastery, directed at a young woman whose game contained the raw materials to absorb and implement it, guided by a player whose understanding of tennis mechanics operated at a level no available coaching staff could fully replicate. Nadal's response was immediate, unambiguous, and delivered without the diplomatic cushioning that public-facing interactions between the two legends had carefully managed across their retirement years. No. Not because Federer's technical observations lacked merit, not because Nadal's competitive instincts had manufactured territorial defensiveness around an athlete his academy had developed, but because of something far more fundamental, a philosophical disagreement about what Alexandra Eala actually needed at this specific critical juncture of her professional trajectory. Nadal believed, with the conviction of someone who had watched her across 7 formative years, that Ayala's developmental requirement was continuity, stability, the deepening of systems already embedded across thousands of training hours, rather than the introduction of alternative technical frameworks, however sophisticated their source. That disrupting her established mechanical foundations with new structural inputs at the precise moment her confidence and competitive identity were crystallizing around Miami's breakthrough results represented a risk whose downside consequences Federer's analytical distance hadn't fully weighted. Federer believed Nadal's 7-year proximity had generated a protective attachment that was subtly misreading what the data of Ayala's game was actually communicating. That longitudinal investment, however genuine, had produced an institutional reluctance to acknowledge mechanical limitations that an outside eye, specifically an outside eye carrying the technical authority Federer had established, could identify and address without the complications that emotional investment introduces into honest professional evaluation. Both positions contained genuine merit. Both were argued with the passionate conviction of people whose competitive careers had been built on trusting their own analytical judgment over external contradiction. And somewhere between the merit of both arguments, the conversation stopped being professional. The hallway outside the tactical analysis room runs approximately 30 meters between the facility's main coaching wing and the administrative offices. Functional, institutional, equipped with the kind of overhead fluorescent lighting that removes any cinematic ambiguity from the behavior of people moving through it. An academy staff member, a junior administrator whose specific role involved coordinating afternoon facility scheduling, was moving through that hallway carrying a tablet loaded with evening session logistics when the door to the tactical analysis room opened and the conversation inside followed both men into the corridor with an energy that the room's walls had apparently ceased containing adequately. The administrator's phone was in their jacket pocket. The video function was activated. Accounts differ on whether this was deliberate, accidental, or the product of the nervous, reflexive documentation impulse that proximity to historically significant moments generates in people who recognize what they are witnessing. 31 seconds of footage, slightly unstable framing, audio carrying both voices with sufficient clarity that the exchange could be reconstructed with reasonable accuracy despite the distance. Federer's voice first, elevated but controlled, the tone of someone who has made a reasonable professional proposal and encountered a rejection they consider inadequately justified. The word limitations, audible, the phrase what the data shows, distinguishable, a reference to something protective that his tone rendered as accusation rather than observation. Nadal's response, carrying the specifically Mallorcan emotional register that people who have followed his career across 2 decades recognize immediately, the passionate, unfiltered directness that press conferences had occasionally glimpsed, but that retirement's reduced media exposure had largely removed from public documentation. The word constructed, audible, a reference to 7 years, delivered with an emphasis that communicated the weight of that investment without requiring elaboration. The phrase, "you watched 4 matches," precise, pointed, and devastating in the specific way that accurate observations deployed in argument become devastating when their accuracy is undeniable. Federer's reply inaudible, body language carrying the information instead. Shoulder squaring, the particular postural shift of someone absorbing a pointed remark and reorganizing their argument rather than their position. Then, a third voice, an academy coordinator who had apparently become aware of the situation's escalation and arrived to manage it with the diplomatic intervention that institutional loyalty requires, regardless of the seniority of the individuals involved. 31 seconds. The administrator's phone lowered, the footage ending. It was inside a Philippines-based tennis fan account within 19 hours, inside every major global sports platform within 36, and the tennis world encountering those 31 seconds with the collective interpretive energy of an audience that had spent 2 decades analyzing every public interaction between these two specific men, began constructing narratives with a velocity and confidence that the footage's genuine ambiguity did nothing whatsoever to slow. Because here's what made those 31 seconds uniquely combustible. This wasn't two strangers arguing. This was Federer and Nadal. And every person watching understood that when those two men disagree about something with genuine emotional investment, the disagreement is never actually about the surface subject. The 31-second clip generated 4.7 million views within the first 24 hours of circulation. This figure, extracted from platform analytics reported by sports media accounts tracking its spread, communicates something essential about the specific electricity generated by this particular collision, because tennis coaching disputes, regardless of the athletes involved, do not typically produce engagement metrics at this scale. This wasn't engaging as a coaching dispute, it was engaging as Federer versus Nadal, the final competitive frontier between two legends whom retirement had appeared to permanently reconcile, resurfacing, unexpectedly and undeniably, in a Mallorcan corridor over a 20-year-old Philippine tennis player who had spent 6 Miami days dismantling the established assumptions of women's tennis. The tennis world fractured along lines that were simultaneously predictable and revealing. Former players whose games carried Federer's technical fingerprints, the attacking, net-approaching, variety-driven style that Swiss tennis had exported across a generation of European players, argued with passionate specificity that Federer's mechanical eye was precisely what Ayala's game required, that his identification of structural limitations in her defensive footwork and second serve mechanics represented exactly the kind of expert external intervention that developmental plateaus demand. That Nadal's protective response reflected the institutional attachment of someone too invested in what Ayala had already become to objectively evaluate what she still needed to develop into. Former players whose formation carried Nadal's philosophical DNA, the baseline relentlessness, the defensive reconstruction, the mental architecture built around point-by-point emotional discipline, argued with equal passion that Federer's 4-match analytical window was categorically insufficient grounds for the kind of foundational mechanical intervention he was proposing. That Ayala's Miami results were not despite her existing technical framework, but because of it. That introducing Federer's technical alternative at the precise moment her competitive identity was consolidating around breakthrough confidence represented a developmental gamble whose downside nobody adequately measured. Philippine sports media operated in an entirely separate emotional register from the tactical debate consuming the broader tennis world. For commentators and fans whose investment in Ayala's career carried the accumulated weight of a nation's sporting identity, the footage represented something both thrilling and anxiety-producing simultaneously. Thrilling because the two greatest players in tennis history arguing over her player communicated her value with a force that no ranking or tournament result had previously matched. Anxiety-producing because the possibility of her developmental pathway becoming contested territory between competing legendary egos introduced a destabilizing variable that nobody requested and nobody knew how to manage. Fan communities across the Philippines generated thousands of responses carrying a unified central message. Whatever these legends were fighting about, the decision ultimately belonged to one person, and that person had not yet spoken. Social media polls, the internet's blunt instrument for quantifying sentiment, ran simultaneously across multiple platforms. Federer's coaching philosophy versus Nadal's coaching philosophy, external technical intervention versus developmental continuity. The results were strikingly divided, not along the geographic or generational lines that typically predict Federer-Nadal preference splits, but along philosophical lines about what athletic development at the highest level actually requires and who holds the legitimate authority to provide it. Former Grand Slam champion commentary amplified the division without resolving it. Each perspective, argued by people whose careers equipped them with genuine authority, landed with sufficient credibility to sustain rather than collapse the debate. And through it all, the viral metrics, the former player commentary, the fan community anxiety, the global split of tennis opinion, Alexandra Eala said absolutely nothing. Her silence, in the specific context of everything surrounding it, was the loudest communication in the entire conversation. 6 days. That was the duration of Ayla's public silence following the corridor footage's global circulation. 6 days during which every platform carrying tennis content generated daily speculation about what her response would contain, what position it would take, which legend it would align with, and what the alignment would communicate about her professional judgment, her loyalty architecture, and her understanding of her own developmental requirements. The sports media apparatus, which had spent those 6 days constructing elaborate frameworks for interpreting whichever response she eventually delivered, was not prepared for what she actually said. She didn't choose Federer. She didn't choose Nadal. She didn't navigate diplomatically between them with the carefully worded neutrality that media-trained athletes deploy when avoiding genuine commitment. She did something that neither the media frameworks nor the competing legendary camps had modeled as a probable outcome. She reframed the entire conversation. In a statement delivered through her official channels, no press conference, no selected media partner, no staged environment designed to manage the moment's optics, Ayala addressed the footage, the debate, and both legends simultaneously with a directness that her 7 years at the Rafa Nadal Academy had apparently deposited at a cellular level alongside every forehand and backhand those training sessions had developed. She wrote, "I am deeply grateful that two people who achieved everything in this sport care about what I achieve next. But I want to be clear about something. My development has always been guided by people who were present for the work, not for the results. The work happened in Mallorca, across 7 years, in sessions nobody outside those courts witnessed. That foundation is not a limitation. It is the reason I was standing on that Miami court at all." She continued, "I welcome knowledge from every great mind this sport has produced, but knowledge offered with strings attached to who delivers it, that is not knowledge, that is negotiation, and my career is not a negotiation." The statement concluded with a single sentence